Welcome to First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship Group, and we are here part 6 today. We're moving forward in the Bible to more and more recent times, but we're still looking at about 2,800 years ago, so still pretty ancient. Today it's Arameans, Moabites, and Israelites in conflict. So last time we talked about King David and King Solomon, and that's roughly the 10th century BC. Now we're down into the 9th and 8th centuries BC. And in biblical terms, we're in the book of Kings, First and Second Kings. So lots of things happening, lots of kings, two kingdoms going on at the same time. But as we move forward in time, we get more and more artifacts, more inscriptions that we can check and compare against the Bible, biblical data. And so we're going to have everything today connects in some way to specific people and events and places in the Bible. So I try to have sort of a theme verse for the presentation. And obviously we have a title. We have conflicting peoples fighting amongst one another. But the spiritual theme I think we could go with today is given on the title screen there. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her, coming from 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 8 and 10. So this was the judgment pronounced against these individuals by first Elijah and then the prophet Elisha. So these are very colorful times, very violent and volatile things going on. So as you go forward, you're looking at a painting here from the Renaissance period that shows Queen Jezebel laying on the ground and the dogs having their way with her. And that would be King Jehu, the newly christened king who just had a coup d'etat to kill both King Joram and King Ahaziah, which we'll get into later. Now, a lot of these paintings that we see, I just put them up there because it's a beautiful work of art and it gives us something to look at. But oftentimes these reflect the period in which they were painted. So we're looking at Renaissance period architecture somewhat and clothing. So it's not really appropriate, but nonetheless, it's worth putting up to take a look at. Give us a point of reference. So let's move into the slides. So chronologically speaking, we've already talked about the Israelite conquest, or as I would rather call it, the incursion with Joshua. And then we have the Judges period where they've moved into the land and they're living in tribal allotments. Then the United Monarchy, which is what we talked about last time, Saul, David, and Solomon. Now the kingdom has split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So that roughly runs from about 1040, actually, one more click here, from around 960 BC up until 722 in the case of the northern kingdom of Israel, when the Assyrians came along and destroyed and took into captivity the peoples of northern 10 tribes of Israel. And the southern kingdom of Judah lasts until about 586 BC, when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar come along and take what's left of Judah, take them into captivity back to the great city of Babylon. So that's the time period we're looking at. In archaeological terms, we call this Iron II and Iron III periods. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is the Tel Dan Stela. We referenced it just the last time around because it mentions King David. And this is the first known inscription that we discovered, that has been discovered, that has David's name on it. And I may have talked briefly the last time about how David is like the prototypical Israelite king. Of course, we know that he sinned, but his heart was after God, and God rewarded him with a great kingdom. But later, of course, it split apart. And so this great kingdom of David we've been looking for decades. But it was until more recent times, it was difficult to find strong evidence of this great kingdom. So many people came to doubt the accounts of David and his conquests and his holdings. But now recently we have inscriptions and other archaeological artifacts that show that indeed he did have a kingdom, and it was a great kingdom. So the first one we look at here is the Tel Dan Stela, which was found at the site of Tel Dan. And it was discovered in 1992. It's actually an Aramaic commemoration. So it's written in the language of Aramaic, very close to Hebrew, but slightly different. This was a language spoken by the Arameans, who were in Syria, whose capital was in Damascus. So this is King Hazael, it's thought. Now it's fragmentary, as you see, so there are large parts that are missing. But the king who was fighting against the two kings, the king of Israel and the king of the house of David, which is how they're named in the inscription, is thought to be King Hazael, because we know he was fighting against these kings in the area of what is today Jordan, or the city of Ramat Gilead, which will come up as we talk further about this. So the specific kings that are fragmentary in this inscription are King Jehoram, who was the son of King Ahab, and he was the king of Israel, and the king of Judah was Ahaziah, or Ahaz. Now, in the book of Kings, 2 Kings chapter 8, we find that both of those kings were engaged in warfare and battle against the Arameans at Ramat Gilead, exactly what this inscription is fragmentarily telling us. And we're looking at the years in the middle of the 9th century, so about 840-ish BC. Now, this, as the story goes in the Bible, Jehoram, or Joram for short, was wounded in battle. So he comes back to Jezreel, which was apparently his military headquarters, and he and King Ahaziah get together, because Ahaziah is the king of Judah. He comes up to meet with King Joram, and they're confronted by Jehu, who is the general called and anointed to be the new king by Elisha, and his representative was sent to the camp at Ramat Gilead to anoint King Jehu to be the new king, which was in a sense saying, you have God's blessing through the prophet to mount a coup d'etat against King Joram. So he runs back with the chariot back to Jezreel, meets those two kings, and with an arrow kills King Joram right there, throws his body into the field or the vineyard area of Naboth, which is now famous. Of course, we're going to talk about that later. And then he pursues. Ahaziah sees this, and he takes off in his chariot. Then he's pursued and eventually shot with an arrow himself. He limps into Megiddo, where he then passes away. So Jehu has taken out both kings of Israel and Judah in one fell swoop, and he becomes the new king. Then he goes back. He continues to Jezreel, where Queen Jezebel is waiting, apparently from an upper floor in this military or sort of command building, and calls down and mocks King Jehu. And then he calls up to the attendants of Queen Jezebel, who were eunuchs, as it turns out, because the Hebrew word saris, meaning eunuch, it says there were 2 or 3 of them attending to her. He commands them to throw her down out of the window, and which they do. She dies as she falls to her death, and then is left for the dogs to eat. So this fulfills a prophecy, of course, that had been proclaimed earlier, that the dogs would consume King Jezebel for all the evil deeds that she did. Then Jehu goes on to finish cleaning house, as it were, and proceeds to slay 70 of Joram's royal princes in the capital city of Samaria, and all who remained from the house of Ahab, as well as all the worshippers of Baal and their idols and temples. So he is just completely wiping out the whole house of Ahab and anyone else who would come along to try to take back the throne from him. This is the way it worked in antiquity. As we take a closer look at the inscription, this is most famous for the fact that it mentions David for the first time in history, and it's called the House of David. And you can see it's referred to here down on the lower right part of that inscription. This is the Hebrew letters blown up, so we're reading from right to left. And to show you the letters that are actually being shown here, it's Beit Yod Tav Dalet Vav Dalet. So that spells out Beit, or house of David. Now, what I'd like you to notice here is that you see the word separators in dots on either side of the name. And that indicates this is one word, but it's called a syntagm. So it's really a composite of 2 words, which has been lumped together and considered like one word. This became an issue with the reading of a second inscription, because some people would expect to find the word Beit and David separated by a dot. But in fact, it's not, because these are considered as one. So it's a very common way of referring to the house of David as just like it's one word. So we move to the Mesha stela. Now this was, remember the Tel Dan stela was written in Aramaic by the Arameans and probably King Hazael, who was residing in Damascus. Now, one of the other enemies of Israel were the Moabites, and they were over in what is today Jordan, in central Jordan. And their main king during this time was named Mesha. So that's who we're looking at here in a large monumental stela indicated with a photograph there. Now, this is a video that won't play, so I'm going to go right through this and look at the inscription in more detail. Again, it dates to about the middle of the 9th century, about 850 BC. And it starts with a command from Mesha's god, the god of the Moabites, Chemosh. So he is saying, Chemosh spoke to me, the king, and he said, go take Nebo from Israel. So Israel was exerting control over Moab at this time and exacting tribute from King Mesha in the form of the wool of thousands of rams and sheep. And that's mentioned in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. It mentions King Mesha by name. So we know that he was under the control of the northern kingdom of Israel at that time. So and this inscription is now saying he is going to rebel against Israel now. And he's describing how he's going to do it or how he did it. So Chemosh says, go take Nebo from Israel. So he says, so then I went by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and maidservants, for I had devoted to destruction Ashtar Chemosh. So that word devoted to destruction, I highlighted because it's a highly significant word. The word is haram or harem. It's where we get the word harem. But in ancient times and in the Bible, it meant devoted to destruction. So it was like a holy war in which your God, whether it was Chemosh or Yahweh, is commanding their people to go and take these people as a devotion to conquer them for me in a sort of a religious sense. So this word devoted to destruction is how we translate the terms in the Bible in the Old Testament. For example, when the Israelites first come and cross the Jordan to take Jericho, they haremed Jericho, and it was to be a first offering to Yahweh. So that was a sort of holy war against the Canaanites by the Israelites. So this is the same concept being used by the Moabites against Israel. So as we move on, I'll just show you a small part of the inscription here, which is line 14. And I just highlighted it so you could see the beautiful inscription that's cut into the stone, which we call a stela. And down below here shows the block letters of the Hebrew, and then the actual transliteration here in English terms, translating as take Nebo against or from Israel. So now we look at the specific mention of the house of David. Now, this is just a newly reread inscription. This inscription has been discovered since the 1860s. So could we actually just silence the phone there a little bit? So this inscription has been well known for well over a century, but only recently a scholar took the original inscription and part of what was formed from a squeeze, because after this inscription was first discovered, the local folks took it, and because of a dispute with some of the local rulers, which was still part of the Ottoman Empire in Jordan, they put this beautiful monumental inscription on a fire to smash it into as many pieces as they could from the heat. And they succeeded. Some of the pieces have still never been found. But before they did that, this scholar who first found it used soft paper or tissue and pressed it into the inscription and formed what was called a squeeze. So we have those lost portions, but only through the squeeze, and that's now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So we have what was rescued and what was lost, but only through squeeze. So he took a look at this through special kind of lighting techniques with different angles, with backlighting, with raking light. And what he found was a dot that had not been seen before, which formed the same syntagm House of David with a slightly different spelling. So here you see the dots on either side of the inscription. This is on line 31 of this inscription. And then as we transliterate into English letters, it's Beit Tav Dalet Vav Dalet. So it's a slightly shorter version. We lack the yod between the Beit and the Tav, but it's still the same word, Beit David, as one word. So there again, we have the house of David mentioned, actually about the same time as the Tel Dan stela, but from the Moabites now. So another attestation for King David himself. And remember, this is now like 150 years after David himself ruled as the founder of a new kingdom or a new dynasty. So the kings of Moab and the kings of Aram still remembered the founder of this dynasty, David, 150 years later. So that speaks to how prominent and how famous he was even long after he had passed away. Now, this particular line actually says, and Hauranen, Beit David dwelled in it. This is a town in the Transjordan, in what was at that time part of the Moabite kingdom, which Israelites were occupying. Now, so we found the syntagms, then both the Moabite stela or the Mesha stela on the top, and there's a comparison of the slightly different spelling, but the exact same thing. And two inscriptions. Now we move to another inscription. Now we're talking about the Assyrians in this case. I didn't want to crowd up the title by having too many peoples in the title in conflict with Israel, but they were also in conflict with the Assyrians. Now we're going to talk more about the Assyrians on my next talk, but we're going to look at some of their inscriptions this time around. This is the ruler King Shalmaneser. Now this is the kingdom of Assyria, which was in what is today Iraq, and they were like the ancient superpower of the day for about 200 to 300 years. They ruled far and wide, and they conquered peoples all the way into Turkey, into Iran, and all through Syria and Israel, and even down to Egypt eventually. But at this point, they're still expanding their kingdom, and they're taking tribute from some kings while they conquer other ones. So this particular inscription dates once again to about the middle of the 9th century. It seems like there's just like a burst of inscriptions that appeared almost at the same time and simultaneous. So here's another nice view of this inscription, and this is King Shalmaneser as depicted, typically with the braided hair and the beard that's braided, and a particular kind of helmet or hat, which is typical of the Assyrians. Now, this inscription, though, is in cuneiform. The script is called cuneiform. The language is Akkadian. So this is Shalmaneser III that's talking about his campaigns into Syria and the West. So he mentions a number of kings and kingdoms, and a famous battle that took place in northern Syria called Karkur or Karkar. So this battle of Karkar is described here in the inscription, where 12 different kings, Aramaeans and Israelites, are combining together to fight against the Assyrian army. And they lose. Shalmaneser wins, but this confederation of kings from the west includes one King Ahab of Israel. And that part of the stela says, this is Shalmaneser speaking now, I approached the city of Karkar. I razed, destroyed, and burned the city of Karkar, his royal city, 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, and 20,000 troops of Hadadezer of Damascus. That's the Aramean king. And then he adds 2,000 chariots and 10,000 troops of Ahab, the Israelite. So here we have the mention of Ahab fighting against the Assyrians, along with the Arameans against the Assyrians. So you see, you get different combinations of people fighting one another depending on the circumstances. But all of these, the Arameans and the Israelites were seeing a common foe at this point, and that was the Assyrians. Interestingly, though, this great battle that was fought that Shalmaneser is bragging all about is not even mentioned in the Bible. Not surprising, because all the battles on all the historical things are not mentioned in the Bible. It's a selective rendition of history according to the goals and the agenda, the religious sort of agenda of the Israelite scribes and priests. So we move to another famous inscription called the Black Obelisk. Now, this is another one coming out of Assyria. This one is now in the British Museum, and it reflects events of which we've already touched on a little bit, 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10, with one King Jehu. Remember the military commander who does the coup d'etat against King Joram of Israel and King Ahaz of Judah. So this inscription shows a number of different kings. Again, this was found in the 1800s. The city is biblical Kala, and known in the Assyrian as Kalhu, and it was found in the central palace of Shalmaneser III. It's 6.5 feet high. It has 4 sides. It's made of black limestone, and it's in the British Museum. It was erected in the year 825. That's mentioned in the inscription, and it describes cuneiform tribute being brought by 4 different kings to King Shalmaneser III during his campaigns in the West. Now, this shows Let me go back to this. Here's a highlight of the one that we're looking at. And this has King Jehu bowing down and kissing the ground. We'll see a blow up of this in just a second. Right here would be King Shalmaneser with his attendants, and then a whole train of attendants to King Jehu following around. If you walked around this obelisk to the four sides, you would have a whole train of people carrying things behind Jehu for Shalmaneser. So now we'll go to the next slide and show, if you were able to see this in one strip, it would look like this. The actual inscription, and then a nice line drawing here showing all of these attendants and all of their various costumes and the things they're carrying as tribute to King Shalmaneser over here on the left side. And you see King Jehu bowing down and kissing the ground before the Assyrian king. Interesting. And the actual inscription says, the tribute of Yahweh, which is generally regarded and accepted as being Jehu, son of Humri, that's Omri, I received. Now it would be not the actual son, but from the house of Omri, which is he's now taken over, of course. It goes on to say, I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, tin, a staff for a king, and spears. And this is repeated for the other kings too. And it goes around in the 360, all of those things, the tribute they were bringing from their lands to King Shalmaneser III. This is how it worked in the ancient world. You would bring tribute to the king until, if it was a very heavy yoke and you didn't want to pay it anymore, then he would bring his armies and besiege your city. And if it, to its conclusion, would destroy your city and deport the people, march them off into captivity and resettle them in another part of their empire, which is what they did to the kingdom of Israel in 722. The capital city of Samaria was besieged, was captured, and marched the people off into captivity. Those are the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And then Judah came along later and was taken by Babylon. So here we have Jehu bowing to the ground. Once again, there's no mention in the Bible of this particular event or that he was paying tribute to Shalmaneser III, but it was a common practice for subject kingdoms. And this is just the same quote again. And blow up. So we know that Jehu was anointed by the prophet Elisha to stage a coup. There's a little bit of review here. He confronted Joram and Ahaziah and slew them both. Queen Jezebel was thrown from the upper window, where she was died, trampled by horses, and then eaten by dogs. And the only thing that was left of her body were skull, feet, and palms of her hands. Imagine that. And it fulfilled a prophecy, of course, going back to 1 Kings chapter 21. And now we're in 2 Kings chapter 9, seeing this prophecy fulfilled. Then Jehu proceeds to strike down the entire house of Ahab, as I said before, all of his great men and his close friends and his priests. So Jehu takes over. This is the actual cuneiform inscription as it appears below the pictorial scene on top. But I wanted you to see some actual cuneiform. Looks like chicken scratch. I can't read it, but plenty of people can. It's a known language. And this is an actual translation of what that inscription says, Jehu, son of Omri. Now we move to Naboth's vineyard. Now you may remember the story from Sunday school, if you think way back, to Naboth's vineyard. So you have King Ahab looking longingly and wanting and envying this Naboth and his vineyard, which was apparently located right next to what King Ahab calls his house, which might be a palace. But the narrator actually uses a different word called Haykal, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So Ahab asks and tries to bribe Naboth to buy his vineyard or to offer him another vineyard so that he can have Naboth's vineyard. Well, Naboth wants no part of it. He says, absolutely not. This is from come down to my family. I'm not going to give up my vineyard. It's too important to us. And he tells King Ahab to go away. So Ahab goes back and broods. And then, of course, Queen Jezebel comes along and says, aha, how can you be such a pitiful king? You need to take control of the situation. You're the king. And she devises a scheme by which she forges a document signed by King Ahab, supposedly, in his authority, to take by force the vineyard. But to set Naboth off, he's falsely accused by a couple of provocateurs, if you will, put up by King Jezebel to make false accusations against Naboth. And Naboth ends up being stoned to death. So at that point, they can take control of the vineyard in a very upfront way. Go Queen Jezebel. So this is Naboth's vineyard. So I want to show you a nice aerial shot of Tel Jezreel right here in the center of the picture. And then it's kind of a low hill. And then Ayin Jezreel, which is the spring, would have been the water source for the people living in Tel Jezreel. And you have Mount Gilboa in the background, a higher mountain. And then in the distance, we're looking eastward to the mountains of Moab. So you're crossing the Jordan and going up into the mountains of Moab, where Ramat Gilead was located, where they were fighting against the Arameans. So you have the whole scene set up right here. Now, I want to point out that in between the Tell right here and in the spring, there's some very fertile areas which they've tested and where they found the evidence of a vineyard. They tested the soil in this area, and it's the only area in this whole area of the Jezreel Valley that has soil suitable for winemaking, interestingly. So this is the area just off the lower part of the Tell into the field here towards the spring where they found this vineyard. This is another view from the Tell itself, looking across and eastward into the mountains of Gilead and Ramat Gilead, the city up in that distance. So the Jezreel Valley is a very strategic area. Megiddo is located to the west a little ways. If you go east, you can go up into the Jordan River Valley and up and down from there, or across into Moab. You can also go up into the hill country from here, up north to the capital of Samaria, which isn't too far away, or you can go south down towards Jerusalem by going up into the hill country north or south. So it's a very strategic spot, and it's the narrowest point at which the Jezreel Valley comes in this area. So it's a perfect place to have a military fortress of some kind. Here's a little picture of the spring. And this is looking across the very narrow Jezreel Valley that looks across to the north to another site called Shunem. Okay, so now we'll look at some of the facts about this excavations and what they found here. So as I mentioned, it's a very strategic spot at the narrowest point along the Jezreel Valley. Earlier excavations in the 1990s exposed a 9th and 8th century, this is contemporary with the events of King Ahab and Jezebel, an enclosure that had towers presumably at 4 corners. They found the 2 eastern towers at the northeast and the southeast. They presume there were 2 more on the northwest and the southwest. They also found 2 towers, as I mentioned, a 6 or a 4 chamber gate. They're not quite sure. And then there was a surrounding wall, a casemate wall, which is a double wall that can be filled in and solidified if it's in times of stress. They also found a rock cut dry moat. So what this all seems to point to is an enclosure. So there's not really a structure here other than a walled in area that would have been used as a mustering area for troops and chariots, presumably. The biblical text has Ahab, as I mentioned, calling it a house, but the narrator calls it this word Hekal. And when you look at Hekal and you compare it to, it's a loan word from the Akkadian, actually from the Assyrians and that culture in Mesopotamia, the word is Ikalu, and that means great house. That could be a palace, it could be a temple. But in the case of the proposal here by the excavator is that it actually is an Ekal Masarti, which actually means a review palace or sort of a military headquarters or enclosure. So that would be like sort of a command headquarters next to, right alongside this enclosure where the troops and chariots could be mustered. So that's probably what we're looking at here, that King Ahab and Jezebel were living in. Also, on the Tell itself, there's very little evidence of an actual settlement or a town. So it seems to be a very functional, a very focused site of military usage, and not one that's unoccupied by civilians. So it was like a mustering station. Now we look at what they found in terms of the vineyard. Now we're looking at an aerial view of an exposure that goes down to the bedrock, and these are cuttings in the bedrock itself. And they're numbered, and I'll just go over some of the numbers here. It's about 130 square foot complex. It's located next to the fertile agricultural terrace between the Tell and the spring. So it's actually down in the fields from presumably where they were growing the grapes themselves. So it was co-located in the field with the vines. Now there's a treading floor. Number 1 is the largest part of this complex. It measures about 34 square feet. So this is where the grapes would have been tread to create the juice, and then a two rectangular vats, number 2A and 2B, where the juice would be flowing into, and then undergoing a fermentation process, and then putting into larger, probably containers in a cooled place, and then allowed to ferment to become wine. And then we have other installation, a basin, number 3 over here, and a whole number of mortars or pits. You can see a number of these around the site, and then 3 of them blown up here. And these are presumably would have been for additives to the wine or other agricultural products that might have been processed in these mortars and pits. So we have a very strong evidence for Naboth's vineyard, and the excavator actually makes that suggestion because it's the largest one in the area. It's the only significant vineyard they found, and it is right next to this military enclosure, this Hakal, which Ahab evidently called his own house. Now, a very interesting artifact here. We've talked maybe just a little bit about these seal stones, which have the names of known figures from the Bible. Now, this is how they would sell or seal ancient documents. You would have a papyrus scroll, which would be rolled up and folded over a couple of times to make into a nice, handy sort of document that you could hold in your hand. Then you would they would tie it closed, and then affix a wet piece of clay, or called a bulla, and then imprint it with their signet ring, or if it was sort of a necklace, and it would be imprinted with the name of the owner on it. So that's what we have here is an opal, which is a very nice seal, because oftentimes they weren't made of this kind of stone. And it's larger than normal too. Now, unfortunately, this particular one was in the possession of a collector, and now it's in a museum. So we don't have a firm provenance for it. So it didn't come out of a controlled excavation, which is always a problem, because forgeries can be made, and forgers are very good at making forgeries because they're worth a lot of money. But this stands a good chance of being an authentic seal from King or Queen Jezebel. So some of the details here, part of it is actually broken off on the top here. Now, what you have here is the actual seal, and then the imprint of the seal, which is what would have been on the document itself. And think about this: when you're having to imprint things, you have to do everything in reverse. So what you're looking at on the right is the reverse, and the one on the left is actually what you want to have and what reads correctly according to the Hebrew. So you have some very interesting features of this seal. This is a reconstruction of the broken part, which presumably would have gone belonging to, which almost all of the seals have belonging to. So it's an ownership of what's contained in the scroll that's being sealed. So unfortunately, that part is missing here, but it makes a lot of sense that that's what part is missing. Now, if you look at more details here, now again, this is backward, but it gives us all the essential elements and the word and the letters. So you have Lamed Aleph up here. I'll come back to Aleph in a minute. And you have from left to right, that's like English, but this is backwards, remember. You have Yod, Zion, and then the lower, it's like a square, left to right again, Beit and Lamed. So Jezebel, which reads, if you reconstruct it with the Lamed, belonging to Jezebel. Now, again, looking at the correct way, reading from right to left here, right, left, and then right to left up here, Lamed Aleph. That's the way it's supposed to look. And what does Jezebel's name mean? It actually means, and it's blocking my screen a little bit here, it means, where is His Highness Baal? Now, we know that Jezebel was a Phoenician princess. She was the daughter of a Phoenician king by the name of Ethbaal, which identifies her as a Canaanite goddess. So this is sort of a claim to deity as a king and a queen, identifies her as the Canaanite goddess Anat, who is the consort of Baal, who is sort of the father king and mother king of the Canaanites. So she's sort of identifying herself as the goddess Anat, or in the Egyptian equivalent, Hathor or Isis, the beloved of Baal. Now, the name in the Bible for Jezebel begins with an aleph. So without the restored aleph up here on the top, you have a slight misspelling of the name Jezebel. And that's been an objection by some people who think, well, it's misspelled because it's not spelled the same way as in the Bible. But if you restore the aleph, you have the exact same spelling that Jezebel has in the Old Testament. So that's strong support for the reconstruction or restoration with the Lamed and Aleph on top. Now, if you look at some of the iconography here, you have a lot of very interesting stuff going on here. You can probably tell it looks very Egyptian, and Phoenicians were fond of imitating iconography from the Egyptians. So you have a sphinx here with a female face and a crown, just like Egyptians. There's the Ankh symbol over here that you may be familiar with, also Egyptian. You have a winged disc here, which is the symbol for Hathor, or the falcon god. And the falcon, Egyptian falcon, is located right here. And then you have two Uraeuses here. These are cobras that are also symbolic of deity in Egypt. So everything in this seal iconographically is actually adapted from Egyptian, which is very interesting. And according to the epigraphers, the letters Yod and Lamed, as part of Jezebel's name, are Phoenician in style and how they're written. So this all kind of fits with what we know of the Phoenicians and what we know of King Jezebel or Queen Jezebel, because she never did really come around to Yahweh and a proper sort of doctrinal beliefs of the Israelites. She was bringing in foreign gods and goddesses from the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. So that's Queen Jezebel. It seems to fit with what we know of Queen Jezebel. Now, finally, we have child sacrifice at Carthage. So the Canaanites, we know, were sacrificing their own children in fires. And it even says that the Israelites started to become like the Canaanites and started to imitate some of their religious practices. They would worship Baal or Baal and Asherah like the Canaanites, and they started to sacrifice their children, in fact, and passing them through the fire, their sons and their daughters, just like the Canaanites. And there was a place in Jerusalem called the Valley of Ben Hinnom, from which comes the name Gehenna and our hell, because that's where the fires and the smoke of these child sacrifices were conducted during biblical times, when particularly evil kings like, say, Manasseh and others were actually sacrificing their children to Baal and Asherah. So for many years, scholars were skeptical as to whether this was really happening or whether this was just some kind of hyperbole. Were the Canaanites really sacrificing their children, and were the Israelites imitating them and following along in this sort of barbaric practice? Well, when they started excavating at the site of Carthage, they found some dramatic evidence. And what they found was, and here's a rather colorful depiction of sacrifice of children to among the Canaanites. The place of the sacrifice of these practices was called the Topheth. In the Bible, it's called the Topheth. So what they found in Carthage was evidence, a huge cemetery that had been in use for over 600 years. And there were 6 or 7 layers of this cemetery, which contained the remains, the burned remains of sacrificial children, shockingly. Now, the story of the founding of Carthage goes back to the Phoenicians. And it was founded, the Phoenicians are the same as the Canaanites. And they founded maritime colonies all across the Mediterranean, in Italy and on the islands, on North Africa. And you can see here a number of other Tophets which have been discovered in the region, both in Sicily, right here off of the toe of the boot of Italy, and Corsica up here. I think even up in Sardinia they found some, and in North Africa here near Tunis, the city of Carthage, founded by Phoenicians. And it continued to grow in prosperity and strength to where it started to rival Rome. And in the 2nd century, Rome and Carthage came into conflict. And the sacrifice of children here at this site continued right down to the time when, in about BC, about 165, the Romans conquered and completely destroyed Carthage and finally put an end to the sacrificial system that had gone on for many, many centuries. Over on the left, you see all these little headstones. And now we get into some of the very graphic evidence of child sacrifice. On the left, you'll see various layers going down, and all these little small urns, these little pottery urns, some of which contained the unburned remains of children and babies. You can see the open part of the vessel down the lower right. These particular ones come from the 7th century. So this would be the 600s BC. Now they went in and they started to try to determine the age of death of all these sacrificial victims. And they ended up measuring the size and the growth of the teeth. And they had to account for the heat, which caused shrinkage of the teeth. And they found that the distribution of age in months, as indicated here on this blue bar graph. And you can see over 50% of the victims found in their sampling from the cemetery were between 1 and 2 months old. That's where the vast majority of sacrificial victims' ages were. And you can see as we go forward in age from 2 to 3 months, from 3 to 4 months, it gets less and less and less. So over about 6 months, looks like they didn't sacrifice any kids older than that. So this was going on for many, many centuries. So this is evidence that the Phoenicians, i.e. the Canaanites, were practicing the very same child sacrifices that are described in the Bible in the Old Testament, of which the Israelites began to take part. Now, some of the headstones are interesting because they give us further information. This limestone stela up in the left-hand corner shows a sheep. So there were some animals they were sacrificing as well, but it was mostly babies. We have a sandstone monument here, which shows the goddess Tanit, which is also derived from the Canaanites, holding a tambourine. Evidently, that was involved somehow in the religious ritual and maybe a musical rendition that was played during this religious ceremony. Another headstone here says, to Our Lady Tanit and to our Lord Baal, right back to Canaan again. And then finally, Baal Hamon, that which was vowed, that which was sacrificed. And then we have a limestone stela over here in the upper right, which actually shows a priest holding a child, presumably as the child was about to be sacrificed. That comes from the 4th century BC. So as we summarize, and I apologize for keeping you all a little bit late, it came out right about on time. We just got started 17 minutes too late. So I hope you all were able to hang with me here. And just as a quick summary here, what we've talked about today, Moabites, Arameans, and Israelites in conflict. We have all kinds of rich inscriptions and data that which ties in so closely and corroborates the historical account given to us in the Old Testament. From the Tel Dan stela, which mentions David, the house of David, to the Mesha stela, also the house of David, the Kirk monolith, also the black obelisk, which mentions Jehu and shows him bowing down to King Shalmaneser III, Naboth's vineyard, which has been identified exactly according to the story that we read about in Kings, and then the actual seal stone of Queen Jezebel, not certain, but a strong case can be made for its authenticity. And the evidence of child sacrifice as described in the Bible, evidence for it found in spades at a number of sites across the Mediterranean that were populated and undertaken by the Phoenicians. So with that, I'll conclude and just remind you all that this is the First Miami Archaeology Discipleship Group. The next talk we're going to have is Sunday, August the 8th, when we're going to talk about King Hezekiah and the Assyrian onslaught, some of which you've had a little foretaste of today. You can also visit us online at firstmiami.org/groups to learn more about First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship class series, and also some of our other groups that we have at the church online. So this is a quick look at the schedule and the upcoming talks all the way to the end of the year. We keep on moving forward until we get into the New Testament later in the year, but we're going to hang with the Old Testament for a couple more months because there's so much more there. So with that, I will say we conclude here with the end of the sunset once again over the Amuk Valley in Turkey. So I guess we can stop our recording if we want to edit this correctly. And if any of you have any questions, I would ask you to speak up now.